Hello, it's Felicia Kelsey. I'm a student at Park University, and this is my second practicum class. I will be presenting my Unit 8 Action Research project. Just a little bit about myself. I live in Independence, and I am a third grade teacher in the Independence School District. This is my third year teaching third grade, and I wanted to take on my master's in reading to become a better reading teacher. My research and its importance. My research question is, how does the use of engaging strategies within leveled groups help students to progress their reading performance or instructional level? I chose this research question because we don't necessarily have a workshop model put into place, but I know that my students work better when they are able to work with each other and get feedback from each other, as well as working in a smaller group with me. I've noticed a large gap in reading abilities within my classes in the last 3 years. For example, I have students who have been performing at a kindergarten or preschool level when it comes to reading and writing, and then I have students that have the abilities to read and write at a 6th grade level, so that's a large gap, and I wanted to work on trying to close that gap when it came to reading. I wanted to try a more hands-on approach with small group interventions to help my students develop their reading skills. Review of literature. Supporting elementary students' reading of difficult texts. This article supports the necessary assessments teachers must complete in order to find the appropriate, challenging text for their students' small groups that are at instructional levels and do not cause frustration. So I'll talk more about the assessments I've used coming up, but that is something that one of them focuses on is finding a text that is challenging for your students, but is not challenging so much that it causes them to be frustrated and not perform well. So this article really supported the pre and post assessments that I've used in choosing my texts that I use with my students during my ELA groups. Examining the relationship between literacy coaching and student reading gains in grades K through 3. Teachers who are working with literacy coaches to help the literacy environment within their classroom better is what this article is mainly about. Similar to the testing I was using, the teachers administered a Dibbles reading assessment for the pre and post assessments to monitor their student growth. Literacy coaches spent time observing and modeling reading lessons and asked the teachers to focus on teaching phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The results yielded significant growth for the elementary students as well as the teachers, which is what I was hoping to do with my research, so I'll talk more about that later. Effects of teacher-student ratio in response to intervention approaches is an article that discusses how having smaller teacher-to-student ratios can greatly impact the students' abilities when it comes to struggling readers. This will be emphasized in my small groups for literacy centers of 3 to 5 students. The interventions that I used within my groups were more as an intervention instead of just a large group lesson because I was in the small groups with my students. I could focus on the needs of those students. I'll talk more about that later as well. More review of literature, automated scoring of students to small group discussions to assess reading abilities. This one talked about quality talk, which is something I used in my groups in my research project. In quality talk, students read a text and then they are engaged in an open-ended group discussion about the text daily. In the text, they did it every week. The goal of using discussions is to increase comprehension, which was the main focus of my groups, is to work on reading performance and comprehension skills, as well as vocabulary. And teaching 4th grade students of different reading abilities to read biological illustrations and integrate in-text information and empirical experiment. Before considering instruction, it's important for teachers to better understand students' needs, to be aware of the reading strategies they use for sense making, and to be aware of the skills they lack. This article was very helpful when it came to my research because it almost exactly lines up with how I assess my students daily with what they need, as well as how I assess them when it comes to their reading and skills that they need to develop. My students, here is a picture of with COVID, we have to stay so many feet apart, and this was when we had to keep our masks on even when we were outside. So I was like, oh, I have to get a class picture. These are almost all of my participants, I think, except for one who was not there that day. I had 18 willing third grade students and parents with permission in my third grade class. I have 8 girls and 10 boys between 8 and 9 years old. My students are predominantly white, but my class also includes children who are Hispanic, biracial, and African American as well. Our school is Sycamore Hills Elementary, located in Independence, Missouri. According to Data USA, households in Independence, Missouri have a median annual income of $48,000, which is significantly less than the median annual income of $61,000 across the entire United States. So we are in a more low income area. However, the students in my class come from multiple ethnicities, as I said, and differing family structures. So that means at home, some of them have 2 parents, some of them are parts of divorced families, so they go to multiple households. Some are raised by their grandparents only or by single parents. Reading level differences are obviously predominant in my class. I have reading levels of my students ranging from 1st grade to 6th grade abilities. Some activities on grade level were difficult for some of my students, and some were not challenging enough for others. So just to hit on some of their background, previous strategies that they learned in reading were in kindergarten and 1st grade with letter recognition, decoding, and Jolly Phonics, which is a program that our district uses to teach the letters and letter sounds. The pre-assessments I used were district-wide assessments, FastBridge Learning, as well as Next Steps Guided Reading Assessment. FastBridge is a computer adaptive test that uses curriculum-based measurements, or CBM, to determine students' reading strengths and missing skills. I focused on the skills evaluated, including decoding, letter and word recognition, as well as vocabulary skills within my groups. The other pre-assessments I used were the Next Steps Guided Reading Assessments to assess their phonics, word recognition, fluency, and comprehension to determine instructional levels, and to identify skills and strategies to target guided reading lessons. That is from Richardson. I also use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to assess all of my students before teaching and learning can take place. As you can see in the visual, there's just a picture of self-actualization, self-esteem, love and belonging, safety needs, as well as physiological needs. So this could mean when my students come in the morning, I need to make sure that they've had breakfast. And if they're tired, I let them rest and put their head down before I can even consider teaching. Or later in the day, if they need a break or need a water break, or they didn't eat much at lunch, I need to give them a snack before we can start our groups so that they can be taken care of. Their needs, their safety, and their self-esteem is important, and that to me comes before teaching. And within our small groups, actually, we were able to build very close relationships that I felt like this year were even harder to attain because of COVID restrictions. I also knew that some students needed help with decoding words, while others needed to be challenged beyond our grade level text. So that was another way of identifying specific strategies to build needed literacy skills within my differentiated small groups. So I was able to see the comprehension skills in my first pre-assessment, which was the FastBridge Learning A Reading scores. My students were identified as needing help developing skills such as context clues, inferring, citing text evidence, and identifying story elements, as well as oral fluency. I created my small groups, as you can see at the top of the screen, 1 through 5. Based on the FastBridge Learning A Reading Report and the next slide, which is the Next Steps Reading Conference, which showed their current instructional reading level. I used corresponding Fountas and Pinnell leveled text for the small groups guided reading lessons. You can also see my students' names. I let them pick. They had some fun with those. These are the Next Step scores. The spring is the most recent before we started our groups. So in this, it also shows the corresponding grade level reading, even though it doesn't show first, second, or third through sixth. That's what those letters indicate. So when it came to my small group setup, I of course had to establish expectations and what I was expecting them to do. So that was my group sign, which I actually showed them daily before we started groups. Groups took place in my classroom within Sycamore Hills during our ELA time. So we had a large chunk of time that we could work. And in between our times, sometimes we would take a restroom break and come back and finish groups. But we met usually 3 days a week, but sometimes 4 if we had to be flexible if time didn't work out for us. I personally had a rolling chair and cart with materials that I needed, such as a pen and notepad to take notes, any texts that the students would need, as well as any hands-on supplies that we used. The students also had a shelf of their leveled texts that they were allowed to get up and go grab for our group. But other than that, the students stayed in their seats and they sat near their classmates that were in their group, and I moved between them. This is an example of our setup. So this is a slide that I would show, and after every timer went off, I would use the timer to make sure we met our time requirement. But after the timer went off, a student would tap the screen and it would rotate. So that group 1 would then be at the station that group 5 was at. And this is an example. We always had a teacher station with reading groups. We didn't start with buddy reading with a partner, but we made our way that way, through adjustments within the groups. Action research is an ongoing thing. So we also had RAS, which I'll talk about a little bit later, a comprehension page that usually was a transfer lesson from a whole group reading lesson. And then spelling or Sparkle is an example of a vocabulary practice group. So the small group focus included literacy circles, in which we read developmentally appropriate texts. In turn taking, the students would each read a page. In most of my groups, in my smallest group, I would do choral reading with the lower kiddos. We would also have in-depth or quality talk about the text, practice decoding and oral fluency, building comprehension skills. We would work on recalling details, determining connections, drawing conclusions with text evidence, questioning the text, as well as inferring. Just some very important comprehension skills that the students had not mastered according to their pre-assessments. Some comprehension activities included the beach ball comprehension, which you see pictured. The beach balls had thinking stems on them about story elements that the students had to answer. And then also we included reading A to Z, which had quizzes, which were in the RAS group that I showed previously. That is a school-wide reading assessment that we are collecting data on for the school. So that had to be a part of our day as it is required from the school. Some of the teaching strategies I used included scaffolding and differentiation. I scaffolded group work depending on the abilities of each group. So my students that were in my lowest group, whenever they would get to an assignment, they usually had a separate assignment, or it would be adapted for them so that they could work on it with each other. But also it was challenging, but not past frustration like it would be if it was the same typical assignment I gave my groups 2 through 5. I also differentiated the level of text that we read for each group, which was a challenging instructional level for each group, and then their vocabulary was the same for all groups except for my first group, which used sight words for different grades. We also use quality talk, as I talked about, using challenging open-ended questions within discussions, hands-on activities such as the beach ball, actual flashcards and matching games. And then we also did partner work, which was very important to work with their peers for them to get feedback from each other and to challenge each other to work harder.